There you go.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
How are we all doing?
We're good.
Wonderful weather. That's something, right?
Yes.
How are we feeling about our projects?
Good.
Okay enough. Very tricky. But okay enough. Yeah, we can ask questions.
Yeah, just a quick one. When you get the draft or first version next week,
Yeah.
are you gonna do suggestions?
Yes.
Okay, so like when somebody sees like,
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was if you're gonna get like suggestions or comments or whatever on your first draft, and 100%. Our goal with the first draft is not to like get you, right? It's to like read it, give you feedback, give you ideas, like sometimes just like, this looks great, like, oh, what a fun garden comments, right? Like it's a hard project for sure, but like our goal is not to like separate the A minuses from the B pluses, right? Like it's to be like, are you learning? How do you feel? Right? Like it's a much gentler process. So you'll get comments.
But then you give it back, and then we build on it for
And
the
then you
next
build on
one.
it. Yeah.
And you give it back.
And then we give it back again with more comments. Yeah, and so if you make an honest effort and you try and you respond to the prompt and you respond to the comments, that's what we're looking for. Right? That's what we're looking for. So
A question regarding, it's kind of a specific question. Figuring out the time that things are in shade. I know that sounds like, well, duh, like it's in
Yeah.
shade because it's behind our house. But, like dappled, light, how do you, I guess, I don't know, I haven't really with that one.
Okay,
Figuring out shade.
yeah, so the question is figuring out shade. And shade is actually really hard to figure out because the other thing you'll see too is that there's like no real good standard for what shade is, right? Because there's sun, part shade, dappled shade, shade, deep shade, and all of those are like how are you feeling on a given day, how you want to define them, right? Like deep shade, I'm gonna say is like under a magnolia. Full sun is not a thing in sight, and it's a great gray area. Also, with the way the sun changes, that's really, really hard. So what we're really kind of asking you to demonstrate, though, is this idea that the shadows and the shade changes throughout the year based on sun movement and leaf coverage. I don't care if the shade starts at 9:30 or 11:30. If you're like, it's in shade in the morning, and then in the afternoon it's in sun. Right? And in the winter, maybe it's in sun all day because the leaf dropped its trees. Or maybe it's actually in shade all day because it's on the north side of the house and the sun is lower. Right? So it's kind of just that demonstrating that you understand those patterns change seasonally and kind of have a rough estimate of what that might look like. But like it's always a reasonable answer to say, and I would know more exactly if I saw it. Right? Because the other thing too is, right, trees grow. So like you're thinking about shade around a house, but if you're thinking about shade around a tree, there's actually no real value in trying to dial that into the minute, year to year, because every year the trees grow.
Great, well, that's what I'm up against, I'm both.
Yeah, right.
Trees and house, and like, like.
And so like you have shade, right? Like it's like what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, like sometimes I might have slightly more sun, but in general I'm working around shade and I have to be picking plants that maybe only need 2 to 4 hours of sunlight or something like that in that range. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't worry guys, this is a gentler process.
Yeah, that's a common.
Yeah.
You're not alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions about the, yeah.
I'm just curious, in the plant toolbox, it goes through the like moisture of the soil, and I'm not sure, like some of them I'm not sure, is this more moist or less moist, like based on how it's described, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like moist, wet, like.
It's like the shade scenario.
Yeah, basically, but for moisture.
Right.
Is
You're
there like
desert or a bog and
is there a scale, like you sort of said, okay, here's at least the.
Yeah, so I mean, I would assume, like, so, and I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but like the plant toolbox does, moist, occasionally dry. I think there's probably some that are occasionally flooded.
Right.
And so what
question was the pH. So if your soil is a certain pH,
Yeah.
and then there's a plant that, oh, I love acidic, but you're not acidic. One plant in a bed, is it worth trying to add more acid to one plant and just let it be?
I would, it depends on how far off you are. If you're a couple, percentage, tenths off, maybe you can try it. If you're like a whole point off, right? If that plant wants 5.5 and you're 6.5, I'd be like, maybe. If it wants 5.5 and you're 5.8,
Yeah.
be like, whatever, roll the dice. What I would say is if you really love that plant, you could always try. Plant it and see how it goes.
No, it's there and it's happy and it's.
Oh, that's fair.
Just let it. I shouldn't keep adding. I shouldn't keep it right there.
Yes, no, you gotta follow these guys' lead, right? If they're happy,
The
just
right
take a step back.
I want it happier.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's not how life works. Happy to happy, don't try to trade up to happier. Yeah.
So I have pretty high extremes between like boggy, wet, and
Yeah.
full sun.
Nice.
So that scorch, like, over watering factor is there.
Yeah.
But it's also on like this tilt. And so I have some plants picked out. I'm trying to keep my plant selection super simple.
Yeah. Smart.
But like, I'm pretty, I keep getting stressed out over the fact that stuff will burn because like my high sun succulent garden that I had in last summer burned,
Yeah.
where it hasn't really been doing that before. It just gets all the nice colors.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, do I tarp it for a while? Is this something that like,
To add shade.
yeah, or should I just pick a totally different area? Because I could do that. I could do like a gentler shady area versus like that high extremes.
So what I'll say is, and this is for myself personally, people do all sorts of crazy things to get their gardens just the right way. And I actually think there's some real epic beauty in that. There's this thing that gardening is the slowest of the performing arts.
Right.
So I'm okay with that. I also know though that if the answer is that I will be doing a thing every year for the rest of my life, I can't be counted on.
That is more me.
You gotta know yourself. So I'd probably be looking at a gentler area, or I'd be looking at plants that are really built for that sort of kind of strong sun. And there are some.
Okay.
There are some. I mean, something that's actually can be really nice is that a lot of our native prairie type plants in this area like bad soil, hot conditions, that kind of stuff. They just have to get established. But once they get established, and typically that actually means starting from very small plants, not from big plants, they can handle a parking median.
That's right.
They don't care, so it's kind of about plant selection. And I can send you some plant lists of that kind of stuff if you're interested.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Do you have
My question was when you mentioned something about wet and things like that. In my own project, should I also include some plants in my collection that really they
Yeah.
fit wet,
Yeah.
and then talked about that as well? I
Yeah,
wasn't really
because it's
considering
It's
doing
helpful
that.
to be able to think through those
Different things.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
My site's not flat. How much do I need to map out the grade? I mean, I can address it in the text.
just address it in the text.
Okay.
I love the idea we're never gonna get these topo maps of everyone's properties, but I think it's nice to text, it's fine. Yeah. Alright, are we feeling okay? And if you guys have more questions, you can ask me anytime today, you can always shoot me an email, we'll get this all figured out. But again, the goal is to get something that clearly demonstrates you've thought about all parts of the prompt and that we can respond to. Right? That's our goal here. So you guys will be fine. You'll be fine. Yeah, one more, okay.
Are we turning these in on paper or can we submit them electronically?
You can do either.
Okay.
You can submit them on paper, you can submit them electronically, whatever makes sense to you. If you submit them electronically, I just ask that you do it by the end of the day Thursday.
Okay.
Yeah. So, if you need 3 more hours, maybe you'll be in an electronic form.
So, when will we get the reviewed copy back then?
I think it's a week or 2 later.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty quick, but what goes on is that every one of them is reviewed, almost every one of them is reviewed by a master gardener, and then every one of them is reviewed by me. So you'll get 2 sets of notes on them.
Scrutiny and double scrutiny.
Yeah. spring with upturned eye never sees so small a thing as draba. He who despairs of spring with downcast eyes steps on it, unknowing. He who searches for spring with his knees in the mud finds it in abundance. Draba asks and gets but scant allowance of warmth and comfort. It subsists on the leavings of unwanted time and space. Botany books give it 2 or 3 lines, but never a plate or portrait. Sand too poor and sun too weak for bigger, better blooms are good enough for draba. After all, it is no spring flower, but only a postscript to a hope. Draba plucks no heartstrings. Its perfume, if there is any, is lost in the gusty winds. Its color is plain white. Its leaves wear a sensible woolly coat. Nothing eats it, it is too small. No poets sing of it. Some botanist once gave it a Latin name and then forgot it. Altogether, it is of no importance. Just a small creature that does a small job quickly and well.
Wow.
I know! Also reads St. Tony Almanac, I see that already. Yeah, I was like reading that before class and I like teared up. So we're going to be talking about some of these small guys, and they really are spectacular because weeds are the ones who can make a go of it where almost no one else can. And Flora might be with us if she's not on the other side. Moss is what can make a weed go of it where even weeds can. Flora is our moss specialist. So those are some really special plants. So with that, weeds, right? This is a talk adapted from a number of other talks, primarily by Nan Lin, who is an emeritus master gardener in our program, and Charlotte Glenn, who is our state program coordinator. So today we're going to cover a number of different things. We're going to cover what are weeds, weed identification, integrated weed management. So this is kind of the weed approach to integrated pest management like we did last week. Herbicides, and what would you do? So a couple of scenarios on how would you solve a problem. It's another favorite weed quote. So a weed is a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. We all, I know, right? I'm like speaking for the weeds up here. So I will say that a weed is a plant out of place, right? That's really what we're thinking about when we think about these things, right? If a tomato plant sprouts in the middle of your lawn, all of a sudden it's a weed, right? But if a tomato plant sprouts in the veggie garden, we're totally into it. So weeds are often just overachievers. Some of the common characteristics we can think about are they're tough and adaptable, they're vigorous and fast growing. They're often very aggressive, and they will often produce a lot of seed. It's one of the things that makes them really good at what they do. They're often very difficult to control, and they often are really adapted to disturbed areas, right? So weeds are the ones that show up, like if we think about it from an ecology perspective, these are our first wave plants in a succession scheme, right? They're the ones who can handle a disturbed, terrible area with nothing else growing. They show up and they're like, let's do this thing, right? And so that's why we often see them in our gardens, because very frankly, we're out there disturbing them a lot, right? It's important to think about kind of the different ways we can view weeds. So if you think about weed or wildflower, right? So dandelions provide nectar and pollen to beneficial insects. Dandelions were actually brought over to North America by European colonists as a salad green, right? That's why we have these here. If you think about wild violets, which I have never understood why anyone considered lawn violets a weed, but some people apparently do. They're a favorite food of different butterfly caterpillars. It's important to be careful with our language here that something can be invasive or it can be an aggressive native, right? So if something is here and it's native to here, it definitionally cannot be invasive. It can still be aggressive and kind of thug, but it doesn't mean it's invasive. So if we think about something like Japanese honeysuckle, right, that would be considered invasive because it's very aggressive and native to Japan, as compared to something like Virginia buttonweed, which will also be a weed for a lot of folks, but it is native to the southeastern United States. So a number of our weeds actually are natives, right? And so for our native gardeners out there, there's something to be said for that. Why wouldn't we want weeds? They can compete with other plants for things like water, nutrients, and sunlight, especially when we think about some of our vining weeds. Some of our most terrible vining weeds, things like listeria and that kind of stuff, right? They'll take down trees, basically. They'll grow so strong over the tree that they choke out the sunlight, right? So they can kill plants, and they can be really, really aggressive. They can sometimes be alternate hosts for plant pathogens, and they can cause allergic reactions, right? So it's not actually goldenrod that makes you sneeze, it's the ragweed that blooms at the same time. Yeah. Like, I'll read you a poetic poem about Java, but like, let's be real, I don't want poison ivy. And there are some benefits to weeds, right? So I think that oftentimes this competition thing, especially for some of our small annual weeds, is really oversold. A lot of times if you have a good diverse planting and you have a lot of different things going on, weeds are absolutely living roots in the soil, which we learned is so important, right? Living roots feed the soil, and they can often grow where little else will grow. So if like weeds are out competing your lawn, it's because your lawn isn't strong. And it's probably because it's too wet, too sunny, too shady, like too North Carolina, for you to have a healthy lawn, and so the weeds are taking over, right? They're filling that space. They're not the problem, they're a symptom of the problem that you're having trouble with these other plants. Some are edible, which is really nice. Violet flowers are edible. Like you can candy them even, I've seen, it's really cool. They can provide habitat and food for wildlife. One of my friends always refers to them as lawn wildflowers, which I thought was really nice. A lot of their native weeds especially can be providing some of the nectar, early season and late season nectar, that we're not getting a lot of otherwise in our landscape. So when we think about weed identification, the most important things are really determining the plant type and its life cycle. So when we think about plant type, we're thinking about really, is it a broadleaf or a grass? And sedges are a little bit separate, but we'll lump them in with grasses for the most part. This is the single most important question when you're thinking about weed control. Is it a broadleaf or a grass? And we'll explain that more in the herbicide section, but it's because a lot of our herbicides kill everything, or they kill broadleaf or grass. Which means that if you're trying to kill all the broadleaf weeds in your lawn, we have a chemical for that. If you're trying to kill all the grass in your flower beds, we have a chemical for that. If you're trying to kill a grass weed in a lawn, we typically don't have a chemical for that, right? We don't have the specificity to kill grass in grass or broadleaf in broadleaf. Life cycle is very, very important. This tells you kind of how to target things, also kind of when to not care, right? Because we'll talk about this more, but for example, right now there's a whole number of weeds that are going to flower that maybe you would mow them to knock out the seed heads, but I would never try to really do a chemical application right now because it's like there are a bunch of winter annual weeds that are about to die in heat. So I can put a lot of time and energy into killing them and they're going to die in 6 weeks. You know. If you can determine, anyway, if you determine these basics, you can control 99% of weeds, right? This is the kind of the broad strokes you need to be able to get. So I like to think of our weeds class as kind of a botany refresher class. You'll see that especially during the exercise because a lot of times when we're thinking about IDing weeds, we are thinking about what type of plant it is, what are the kind of botanical terms we would use to describe it to be able to identify it. So remember we have our broadleaf plants and our grasses. So the broadleaf plants are the ones that are going to have webbed veins as opposed to the grasses that have kind of these long veins, right? We'll have typically a growth pattern where you have nodes going up and branches coming off, whereas grasses tend to have, they might have leaves coming off, but it's a single thing. And one thing I'll point out here that's important for understanding weed control later is that, remember, at each one of these nodes on a dicot or a broadleaf, you can typically get growth, right? These are all growth points, including up here. So I can whack this thing up here, I've knocked out all those growth points, and I've really taken that out. Whereas on a grass, often the growth point is actually down here at the base, and that's the only real strong growth point. And so we'll talk about like a flame weeder later. A flame weeder, which is killing things with fire, which we talked about last week. If I don't hit that growth point down here, even if I singe all of that, the true growth point is down here, right? So the control becomes a little bit different. So again, we have 2 seed leaves, we have net-like veins, 1 or more leaf at a node. They can be opposite or alternate. No, you're good, you're good. They can be opposite or alternate. That can be very, very important to understand whether you have an opposite or alternate arrangement of your leaves. Branched growth habit. And this is typically where you see showy flowers, if you're going to see them. Although some grasses have very showy flowers, but it's typically where you see showy flowers. Many shapes and colors, often very small. Right, so you're going to see things like clover in here, dandelions, plantain. leaf at the node and much, much longer than wide on the leaves. They may be upright or spreading. A lot of the grasses are super successful because they adapt to mowing really well. So if you mow over something like goosegrass, it just gets flatter and flatter and flatter and flatter, right? So these survive because they're typically under our mowing height. Once they start getting the message that like going up is not the plan, they just start going out. And they often have very inconspicuous flowers, but there are certainly some grasses that will have big, showy kind of inflorescences, right? Where they're not super colorful, but they're big and a lot, right? Which is really fun.
Can I?
Yeah.
In regard to the grasses that get mowed and
Yeah.
then spread, would that apply, is that what that wire grass is that everyone hates that's in our lawns or
Mhm.
what? Okay.
Yeah, like, and that's that's why weeds are really good at what they do, right? Is like, a lot of our like plants that are not quite so enterprising, you whack them off and they're like, oh, I have been whacked, right? The weed is like, got it. You know, like, it just figures out how to do it, or it'll seed even faster, or it'll figure out a strategy, and that's kind of what makes it a weed, right? And then lumped in with the grasses, because they're also monocots, are the sedges, and the sedges are really interesting. So the way you remember this is sedges have edges. If you were to roll this main stem between your fingers, you would literally feel the edges of it. And sedges are kind of cool because instead of having a branch pattern where they put off, typically 2 leaves, they always put off 3 leaves, right? And they put them off in this kind of like like 3 separate directions pattern, right? So sedges are, we call them like 3 ranked, right? Instead of 2, they're 3. The flowers can be either kind of these clusters or these spikelets, like that look like sparklers, which is pretty cool. Sedges are super hard to deal with, and it's because of the way their roots are structured. They can be warm season annuals or perennials, and they basically have, you'll hear them referred to as nut sedges. They have these little tubers all along their roots, and each one of those can sprout any plant. So if you pull this guy up and you like feel triumphant, but its roots are still there and there were 5 nuts, you got 5 more plants, right? So sedges are really good that way. A couple of other monocot plants that you might run into is common rush, wild onion, or garlic. Wild onion and garlic are not the same plant. One of them is hollow and one of them is solid, and I always forget which one is which. You can treat them like they're the same, it's fine. This is a great one that I don't understand the point of treating, because it comes up every single spring and then you mow it and then you're kind of done. So it like looks raggedy until you mow your lawn the first time and then you move on with your life. And it means that when you mow your lawn the first time, it smells like garlic, which is just like a wild experience. And then we have blue-eyed grass, which is not actually a grass, but it is a monocot. I actually bought some of this at any of the plant sale last year. I was like, this is just a great plant. So in order to understand the weed life cycle, or to understand how to control them, you really need to understand the weed life cycle, and this is where we think about annuals and perennials. Biennials are real, but let's treat them like souped up annuals in a way, right? Like an annual is gonna live 1 year, a biennial is gonna live 2 years, a perennial could live 2+ years, right? We don't know, it doesn't have a determinate period on it the way that the annuals and the biennials do. So you have warm season and cool season. This is an example of a summer annual. You've seen this before. Remember, the biennial would just stretch this over 2 years instead. Typically has a basal rosette stage where it germinates and it exists as a bunch of low flat leaves for a while, and then it kind of goes to flower in the second season. Perennials instead, right? The crazy scheme where all of a sudden there's like plants in space floating off and this kind of stuff. And it's because there's seeds, there's roots, there's everything, right? They're gonna propagate any number of different ways. The annuals and biennials are gonna propagate by seed. These guys are gonna be propagating by any means necessary. So we think about dandelions, we think about grasses, we think a lot about, right, this is a perennial that propagates very well by seed, but also can propagate by root bits. A lot of our grasses and spreading perennials especially are going to be propagated by stolons and rhizomes. Remember, these are those special tissues where stolons creep just over the ground, rhizomes creep just under the ground, but they're these creeping structures that basically means that if I were to come along and cut this here, each one of those would become a plant, right? If I were to cut this here and here, I would get 3 plants. And so this is the hard thing, is like when you go out to the garden and I will dominate. Okay, and bulbs and tubers, and most of where we see bulbs and tubers is gonna be things like the nut sedges and the onions and garlics and that kind of stuff. This isn't quite as common, but it definitely exists. Annual weeds, it's all about that seed production. It's all about the seed production. I think this is a really cool little weed. This is chamber bitter, and you can see these a little tiny bit right here. You have these little tiny like drops down, and if you were to flip it over, you can see it right here. You have these like perfect little structures underneath. It's just a very delicate, interesting little thing, right? Oftentimes, the annuals have simple root systems, and they may root at the nodes, but they don't form stolons or rhizomes, right? An annual has no interest in building these longer-term structures because it's a live fast, die young strategy, right? Where they're just trying to get out there and make seed, as much seed as possible and go on. They're like, I don't care about roots, I don't care next year, I don't care any of this, right? Like seed, all the time. This can be a problem because you can get a really big weed, like a seed bank in your soil. Seeds are the dormant stage that are meant to stay protected, right? They're supposed to wait for a better day. So oftentimes they can live for years and years and years and years, right? This is why you can have a beautiful, pristine spot and all of a sudden the weeds are still coming up. And it's like your seed bank is still there and your seed bank is going to last longer than you are. So this is part of your journey. Like, it's fine. And the increase can be really exponential. So pigweed, this is more of a pasture weed, but it can produce, almost 120,000 seeds in a season, right? Their goal is just to throw out as many seeds as humanly possible, typically, because some of them will take. So we're in kind of a fun phase right now where we have our cool season annuals popping and we have our warm season annuals coming, right? So we're kind of right in here a little bit. And we're going to be seeing all that flowering. It's starting right now. I have just been seeing some new winter annual weeds flowering in the past week, like some of my favorites have been coming out, which is great. And also when I was digging around to find some of the plants for the activity, I could find baby germinants of crabgrass, right? So like everything is happening right now. It's kind of a really active phase. There's almost no point in trying to treat these plants anymore unless you're trying to remove seed to just deplete the seed bank a little bit. This is where we can still be doing a little bit of treatment, and we'll talk about what that means. Some examples of annuals you might run into, right? So you have crabgrass, you have speedwell. There's a number of different species of speedwell in the area. They have these really delicate flowers. I don't have any with us today, but if you ever want to see, on the back corner of the building, back there, there's like a case for propane tanks that's been broken into. And there's a grassy lawn right up against the building, and it's completely full of this speedwell called bird's eye speedwell, that if you get down underneath and you really look at it, has the most delicate blue flowers, like little dark markings in it. It's my absolute favorite of all the winter annuals. It's just blue and beautiful and delicate and a very intricate flower. So like worth checking out if you're into it. We have polygonum, we have smartweed, this is a summer annual. This is henbit, this is a field of henbit. I love henbit because like when it takes over the lawn goes purple. And it's gonna die in like a month. So like it's not that stressful, right? Like it's just like a field of purple when you kind of wonder if it's like ever gonna get warm again, right? It's very nice. And we do have some that I would say are a lot more dastardly that I would try to take out. You have things like stiltgrass.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, right on.
What is it?
Stiltgrass.
Oh, yeah.
You might hear it called microstegium too. You might hear it called by its scientific name. It's really bad. It's taking over our forests. It's like I'll talk forever about the weeds. I think are the sweet weeds, but there are weeds that just need to die. And it's because of the way they disrupt our natural ecosystems. Right? Like I'm annoyed that it's in my lawn. I'm really annoyed that it is basically shading out every small plant in our forests. Right? It's kind of taking over these habitats. And we'll talk about why and how you can control some of these. This is a place I use herbicide, right? Where I'm like death from above, I don't care, like we're gonna knock you out. And then this one is a native, or I don't know if it's native or not, but a nice little grass weed, poa, also called annual bluegrass. This one's not so bad. This is the grass that when you see it, you have to watch out for it, and you'll see it everywhere once you've seen it.
How do you spell that? Microstegium?
Microstegium,
Oh, Stegium.
yeah, Microstegium.
So on the alveolar trail, they have this thing chart with different plants. They call it Japanese stiltweed.
Yeah, you'll hear like Japanese silkweed, siltgrass, Asian siltgrass, like anything in that area. Yeah, you're talking about this.
Yeah, and I did try to get rid of that, and it did put herbicide, but I had to gown up and everything else. It's like, I've got a lot of things about putting it out. And it got rid of it, you got to get it early, but it still came back.
Yeah, so
And it's just like,
siltgrass is best because it develops a really good seed bank. And so like over at Duke Gardens, I know they're working really hard on getting their siltgrass populations in check. And it means killing it early. Any that comes up, they have to really aggressively make sure it doesn't go to seed, right? And then even then they have, I think they're optimistic or hopeful that maybe they've started instituting burn regiments in some parts of their prairie plantings that they're hoping that can also help because it's not burn tolerant. But like, that's a lot.
It's just crazy. I mean, because it came out of out of a culvert that comes out the side of it. And it came down there, and then it just spread over everything. My neighbors everywhere. I was like,
Yeah, it loves water. It loves water, and so that's kind of where it's really coming from.
And the seeds live for a long time, right?
yeah, I just gave up on it.
This is our cross cutter, you guys.
What is that on the upper left-hand side?
This one here is a crabgrass. So some of the perennial weeds, they certainly can produce by seed, like you think about dandelion, but they're often the real story isn't the roots, right? That's where they're propagating by having their stems cut, their roots cut, anything else like this. So if you're going to pull these guys up, you need to get every single node that's touching the soil that you possibly can. Anything you leave behind will resprout. They often require multiple treatments to kill because of that. Mowing or pruning them back multiple times, hand pulling or herbicides. The reason that mowing and pruning multiple times can work is because remember the way a perennial survives is by putting all energy into its roots for the next year. And so if it leaves out in the spring and then you go through and pull all that out, then it'll have to leaf out again, and that takes a lot of energy. And then if you go through and pull all that out, then it has to leaf out again, right? And so after doing that enough times, you've exhausted the roots, right? They don't have enough to get through the winter, but this could take you time. And so especially if we're thinking about some of our woody weeds, getting the shovel and just really trying to pull that thing out with as much root mass as possible is going to be your best bet. Some of the root systems you can run into, so something like a simple clump forming root system is more likely to be reproduced by seed, right? These are the ones that have some action in the roots, but they're a little bit more annual-like in their habit of producing seeds. So dandelion does have a taproot, but it's a more simple root system still. Dog fennel, Virginia buttonweed. It's in contrast to spreading, so it's wiregrass, right? This is one we talked about, white clover. These are the ones that every single place they touch, they're going to reroot. Which is amazing. I mean, it's like one of the things I think can be really nice about, for example, growing squash, is that oftentimes squash will root multiple times, which is great because it means if you have squash vine borer, it typically only kills the point closest to it. So in squash, I'm like, this is a great habit. In weeds, I'm like, ugh, darn you, plant. And then tubers and bulbs. And this is going to be things like our nut sedges, our wild garlics. And so those are the little nuts you can see on the sedge roots, right? So each one of those can easily grow a new plant. That's everything you need for the new plant. So if you pull this guy off right here, I can see at least 4 new plants on him.
So how do you get rid of nut sedge? Is this have that root system that's like stuck in the grass?
Yeah,
Or is it less way to get rid of it?
stuck in the grass too. So nut sedge in grass, right, is monocot and monocot, right? And that's hard. We don't have good chemical control for that. Mowing it down really aggressively, like making sure you're keeping on top of your mowing schedule for your grass would be effective. If it's in your flower beds, it's sitting down and taking the time to pull that plant out and get that. There are some herbicide controls that are specifically for nut sedge, so like sedge hammer. Yeah. So there are some ways to do it, but this is one where you just kind of like, once you see, the first time you see it, pull it. Right? Like, the best defense is a very strong offense, but like, once you have it, you just know you're going to have to keep going at it. And mowing will at least help exhaust it. Yeah. So some examples of some of our perennial weeds. This is Florida betony, which I think is cool because it's got this wild root system. Like, look at that thing. rub snake thing. I don't know, I love it.
What type of root is it?
It might be a type of stolon. I'd have to look up exactly what that thing is, because that's like such a modified structure that like that we start giving that special names. Right? Like that's weird. That's got a weird botanical name, I'm sure. Can anyone take a guess at what group this plant is in? Do we have any good like botany nerds?
Lamiaceae?
Yeah! Okay, so this is something I realize is helpful to know. So Lamiaceae, that's
Mint family.
the mint family, very good. So when you start seeing these flowers that often are very pulled back on the sides and kind of have this like really strong verticality to them, those are often Lamiaceae. Lamiaceae is also known for having square stems. So if you roll it between your fingers, you can do that. A lot of our, there's a number of, especially annual weeds and some perennial weeds that are in the Lamiaceae. And I just point that out because I think that's a really cool flower structure. It's very pretty. Oftentimes if you look into these flowers, they'll have dots and stripes and everything down in here, a lot of like delicate coloring, which is nice. Okay, sorry. That's just for me. Sedges, dandelions often, obviously, plantain. There are multiple different species of plantain. It's not that kind of plantain. It's just also called plantain. The joy of common names, right? And then this one, there are a number of different species of sorrel. Sorrel looks a lot like clover, right? Look at these. But clover's flower is a bunch of tiny little flowers in a ball. It's a very globe-shaped flower, whereas sorrel has a flower that looks more like if you asked a kid to draw a flower, right? Like if you asked a 5-year-old, they'd be like petals, right? And it would be that. And that's a helpful thing to know because remember, the way that plants are related is not by anything like leaf structure or anything like that. The way the earliest botanists figured out how plants were related was by flower structure. We learned that in our botany class because that's actually really, really, really evolutionary concern. So it's just easy to know. Sorrel is also interesting because many of our sorrels have a slightly bitter taste to them, and they can actually be used very lightly as a salad green for like a nice kind of bitter, like flavorful taste, a little bit tart. Too much of them though, and I think they are diuretics. So, nice to taste, interesting fact, I wouldn't go ham on them. Yeah.
I have a sorrel that's for salads, but looks
Yeah.
nothing like that. Do I have the wrong idea on that plant?
No, you probably do.
It's tall leaves.
Yeah.
Or, oblong
Yeah.
with red veining through it.
I think it's different, it's
The
a
whole
common name situation.
Okay.
Yeah, I know which one you mean.
Thank you, because
Yeah.
that looks nothing like it.
These are fun because they do get these really highly pressurized seed capsules that when you go to pull them out, the seeds can shoot 10 to 15 feet. Which is just a fun fact. They know you're coming. And then some of our woody weeds, we have trees, things like Chinaberry, tree seedlings, Ligustrum, which is like public enemy number 1 if you have it. Privet, brambles, poison ivy, greenbrier, Japanese honeysuckle. These are a lot of things that we have to be a little bit more careful about because they really will escape into our woods, the non-native ones, and especially the vines can be very, very, very aggressive. And right, and so when we think about weeds, right, remember weeds can be huge. Like mimosa trees are weeds. Right, at this point I would say that Bradford pear is a weed. Right, so we're talking about everything from sorrel to a Bradford pear. Right, all of these things can be weeds. And I class things really differently for myself between like it's a little bit annoying in my landscape. That's one category of weeds. Poison ivy gets an exception of like it actively makes me break out, so like it's gone. And then it's a real problem in terms of its invasiveness and the fact that it can disrupt local ecosystems. Those are things I want to be pulling out, right? And those are things I want to be targeting more. They often produce fruits that are spread by animals. That's why poison ivy spreads so well, because birds love its berries. It's really, really tasty. And many are escaped ornamentals.
What's an escape ornamental?
Yeah, so it's like Ligustrum or privet. This was planted because it had nice white flowers and was evergreen, and everyone thought it looked really nice, and then it got out into the woods. So like it's something we planted because we wanted it, like Bradford pear, and then it escaped, and now it's everywhere.
It ran away.
Yeah, it ran away.
Are birds, like, are they immune to urushiol?
Immune enough.
Okay.
You know, it's like I don't know, but it's a good question because birds are interesting in that like they also don't.
Say
Yeah, they don't
And what time of year do you treat it?
You can treat, no point in treating when you don't have leaves. Don't worry about that. You can treat in the spring as it's flushing out, and typically a good kill then. You can also treat in the fall before it starts going dormant, right? Because glyphosate and triclopyr are both systemic, meaning they move through the whole plant and kill it that way. And so my goal is either to get it as it's waking up, and there's a lot of active movement, which is great because it'll move those chemicals through the plant, or right before it starts going to sleep, because that's when it's putting all of its energy down into its roots. And so there's a lot of movement down into the roots, so it can help get that chemical down to the roots to kill it.
And if it's around a tree and stuff, are they?
That's why I really prefer glyphosate
Okay.
instead of triclopyr. So triclopyr can have soil residual activity in that, like, if it hits the soil, it will still be active for a while, and if it hits bark and other things, it will be active for a while too, whereas glyphosate is really most effective on green leaves. Glyphosate has a really bad rap right now because it's the active ingredient in Roundup, and there were lawsuits out in California over it. I can talk about that more in a second, but the long story short is that if you are a landscaper who is doused in these chemicals every day for 30 years, I don't know that we have the research to show that it will cause you a problem, but there are people who have developed problems. For the typical homeowner who uses them a couple times a year wearing PPE, we have no evidence of that problem, and there is a logic that says they impact those plants, not poison ivy is native, but we're thinking about something like stiltgrass or wisteria. The negative ecological impact that those plants have is so profound that it's preferable to use an herbicide to kill them and to really get them out of that ecosystem quickly than to like pussyfoot around the issue. Yeah.
At what point will you remove the tree weeds, like trichoderria or something like that? Especially if they're like full grown.
Yeah, but full grown. Yeah, I took out the like, not full grown, but like 18-foot Bradford pear this winter. I should have done it in like March or April, right? When that plant starts breaking bud and starts really moving all of its things, what you can do is you can cut it down to the ground and then paint the stump with glyphosate or triclopyr, right? Because it's got all of the cellular stuff, all of the plant stuff is moving. You cut it down, you paint the stump according to the directions on the label, and it's done. I can do it in winter. I will have to look out for suckers. But typically, anytime when it's actively growing, so spring through early summer is really, really great. You could also do it in the fall again when you know it's translocating everything back down to the roots. But it's unfortunate because it's a cut it down, paint the stump situation. Yeah.
Is that the same thing you would do with like thicker poison ivy, like when it's gotten like really big, you could cut it and
You can definitely cut it and paint the stump. And we have I'll talk about a publication a little bit that's from the North Carolina Botanical Garden about how they use herbicides to control. They're talking about invasives, but it's a really good thing to think about with woody weeds, perennial, like vining weeds, that kind of stuff. Some of the different techniques you can use for control there.
Can I ask a herbicide question?
Yeah.
So I have a friend who worked for Monsanto, and she was saying the glyphosates are like the safest if used properly. And it was in a group, and every one of them was like, that causes cancer. And she said, no, they got a bad rap.
Yeah.
So then, if you're like volunteering and you maybe suggest that, like for the next 3 weeks, all we got was emails about how this caused cancer. Not one person said, okay, here's a person who worked in the field, a
Yeah.
scientist, she knows what she's saying. They all were like, it causes cancer. And not one person's mind
Yeah.
changed. I mean, what do you do?
And so what I do is, and I'll admit, like, I have a bias on this, because like once, I don't actually think it's a bias. Once you look into the research and once you start looking at the cases and like once you start kind of looking into it, what I would say is that there's not strong research-based evidence that we've seen that sort of cancer coming from these chemicals, even with really long exposure. But I will say that a lot of that research is paid for by Monsanto and by Dow and by Corteva, and so I'm like, that's hard to know what to make of that. But I also think that if we had a massive incidence of this, we would see it. And the cases are very hard to find, like to the degree that. So I don't think the cancer thing is really strong. So what I'll say is, we get to our herbicide section from the North Carolina Botanical Garden. That is our native plants botanical garden. That's what they do. That's where their heart is. And it's a publication on how to kill things with herbicides. And so I like kind of invoking that authority, right? To be like, I'm like, the native plant people want you to do this. You know? And if people don't change their mind, it's totally up to them, right? Everyone gets to manage their property, unfortunately, however they want. But you can say just like, this is where the research is, this is the information we have to share, take it or leave it, and you don't really need to engage in the conversation past that. You know? But I do tend to invoke like North Carolina Botanical Garden especially. Right? But yeah, a lot of people just like they're never gonna hear it. They're never gonna hear it. And the unfortunate thing is that glyphosate is actually, for a lot of reasons, much less environmentally harmful than a lot of the chemicals we're moving toward because glyphosate's getting a bad name. Right? So if I go up to one of the big box stores right now and I look at any of the Roundup formulations, almost none of them have glyphosate as their active ingredient. They all have triclopyr. Triclopyr does have soil residual activity though. So if you misspray it and you hit the ground, it could get taken up by anything, right? Like you could kill a bunch of other stuff around it. Glyphosate, once it hits the ground, it gets so bound up into clay and the organic particles that it degrades into its inactive ingredients before it ever can get out, right? So it's like it hits the soil, it's bound up, it doesn't work anymore, which is a really good thing, right? Because you used to think about these herbicide applications where they accidentally spill and then all of a sudden like all 3 big trees are dead. You know, that doesn't happen with glyphosate. Oh, and this is just a plea to be kind to Virginia creeper. That's what this is. So these are both natives. They're both natives. Poison ivy, I understand. Like you do you. Do what you need. Virginia creeper is also fine though. It's got 5 leaflets. It's native. It's nice. It climbs up things. It's minding its own business. It doesn't make you itch. Just because you see something with, you know, a compound leaf climbing up a tree does not mean that you need to, you know, take it out. So know that Virginia creeper is not the same thing as poison ivy. This guy is totally fine. He's just minding his own business. He's just kind of like guilty by association. Okay. All right, integrated weed management, which I think is kind of what we're moving into anyway, which is great. So weed management absolutely requires an integrated approach. Really, 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 most of this is about prevention. An ounce of prevention really is what kind of cure with weeds. Thinking about what you're doing, not bringing weeds onto the property as much as possible is really helpful. Being kind of thoughtful and careful with what you're doing. We'll talk about that in a second. Cultural controls, mechanical controls, and some chemical controls. We're going to cover these last because typically you want to be going through these steps first, right? Chemical controls are safe if you follow the label and if you do exactly what you're supposed to be doing. But they are, I like to think of them as the last safe step on the ladder. It is safe. It is not safe to jump to that step, right? You gotta climb up to it. So for annuals, because they're so seed heavy, hand weeding, spraying if you want, and then mowing before the seed production, right? So if you see a big, oh my gosh, I've got this shady kind of wet area in my space and all this stilt grass came up. Late summer, you want to be weed whacking that back regularly. You want to be mowing it back if you can. Anything to prevent the seed production, right? Because it's very, very hard to kill annuals once they're up and growing and healthy and like reproducing, but you can at least prevent them from going to seed. Yeah.
Is there a benefit to cutting them and leaving roots in the soil versus pulling out roots and all?
Yeah, I mean, I
in
think
terms of the weeding?
I guess it's how like ambitious I'm feeling, right? So some areas are so large, you're just not going to do the pulling. You're just not going to realistically. So then I'd be weeding. But if I had the energy to go through and do the pulling, I might actually try to get the roots out. And that's simply because I can't trust my future self to come back and weed whack at the right time, right? Like if I have the time now to pull it out, roots and all, I'll often do that because future actually is unreliable.
Yeah, because there's some guidance with like native plantings. If you pull it out, you disturb soil, and so there's probably more seeds there, so it's better
And you
to
can get
just
all
cut them.
flush again. Yeah.
You know, it seems like a lot of extra work actually to cut, right? That's
Yeah.
just-
Yeah. So, right, we know that if you ever needed to till your yard for some reason, there's a tiller at Briggs that you can borrow. I would absolutely take a hose, wash off the underside of the tiller in your driveway or someplace else like that before I just started going to town in the yard with it, right? Because who knows what the last place that was tilled looked like, and all those weeds can get stuck up underneath. Wind, dandelions, right? They're just coming in from all sides. Infested topsoil. This is why it really is worth buying topsoil, like from a soil yard or someplace like that, where you actually know where it came from and that it was treated, right? I think most of us are not like just scooping soil out of other people's spaces, but like don't also. Don't. That's how you get nutsedge, okay? Visitors, humans and animals, they stick to fur, bird droppings, muddy boots, right? So if you are trouncing around somewhere that has a really bad Japanese siltgrass infestation, and then you go back into your own yard with those same muddy boots, you might have a bunch of seed and everything else stuck to you. And then, like Japanese maple or like big buttercup, right? A lot of these are coming from rainwater runoff and flooding, so they're moving down waterways, right? So if you have wet spots in your yard that show up that are connected to any other wet spot, you'll probably have wet spot weeds, right? When we think about sanitation, cleaning our equipment and our tools, it is always good practice, if possible, to be working from clean to dirty in our yards, right? So if you have a part of your yard that's got almost no weeds, it's really, really nice, or a part of your lawn like that, and then you have a part of your lawn that's really, really infested and has a lot of weeds, I would start by mowing probably the clean part into the dirty part, and then I would hose off the mower and clean everything out if I could. If I was feeling that ambitious and I really didn't want it to spread. Right? In general though, you want to be working clean to dirty in your yard. Weed seed really can cling to equipment and tools. And it's especially important when you're working in an area with known infestation, right? And so the place where I might pay more attention to something like this is where I have a lot of stiltgrass, or where I have a lot of like wisteria seedlings coming up or something like that, right? That might be a place where I actually take a moment, wash off my tools before I go work in another part of the yard.
Now you just wash them with water.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it off, but I'm just making sure I wash in a place that's like over pavement or over, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to just actually be watering the seeds as I. I took this picture. I just love that. That's like so common when you go to buy a tree to see like this situation. You're like, sure, sure. So don't bring weed seeds in. They're often present in container plants. Bald and burlap root balls on trees can absolutely have weeds. Gift plants. A lot of times, if you're really not sure about the yard it's coming from, you can actually root wash the plant, where you take it out of the pot, you wash it off with as much water as possible to get those roots opened back up, and then plant it, and that's perfectly fine. Topsoil is, again, enemy number one. You will get it with topsoil that's not like purchased, treated topsoil, right? So like the topsoil you buy from one of our stone centers or rock centers typically has been heated and cared for in a way that it won't have weed seed in it. Another place that you can get weed seed that I think is very interesting is in bags of grass seed. So this is the back of a bag of grass, and it's got, you know, fescue, bluegrass, it's a cool season mix, right? That's great. And then it's got
Weed seeds.
yeah, inert weed seeds, 0.05%, noxious weed seeds, those little seeds can't grow through it, right? And so there's a balancing act you're trying to play here, where if you don't, if that's not you, and you're just trying to keep the weeds down, mulch. It adds organic matter to your soil, it's wonderful, it's good. If you're worried about having your native seed in really beautifully and fill out, you know, maybe then you go a little bit lighter on the mulch, and you just know you're dealing with an annual weed problem a little bit because of that, right? Like that's a trade-off. I realize that as we go through this class, you will get different messages, right? You will get like, always add organic matter, it's the best thing ever. Mulch is phenomenal. Mulch prevents native weed seeds, or native seeds as well from germinating, okay? Pick which one is more important to you, right? When you start layering all these different chapters and all these topics on top of each other, you will find places where you don't know what the answer is because you've received two different directions of information. It's about finding the balance for yourself personally, because unfortunately this is complicated information. And like what your job is not to be like a robot that can spit out the right answer. Your job is to like be a human who can discern the value of different goals and which ones you want to prioritize. Yeah.
What about sheet mulching with cardboard?
Yeah, so super effective. Will keep seeds from getting through it, be they weeds or much loved native perennials.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, because what this works on is, and when they say it only prevents annuals, what they're really like, what that really means, it only prevents plants coming from seed going through. So if you have an established perennial with an established root system, it will grow through this 3 inches. If you have a perennial seed or an annual seed and it germinates, it can't get through that 3 inches. So sheet mulching certainly works, you know, and then you don't need the 3 inches. Typically, like sheet mulching with cardboard is not to keep anything down. Sheet mulching with newspaper is like keeps the less hardy things down. Yeah. Don't do landscape rubbers. I'm sorry if you've already done landscape rubbers, because I like don't have a balanced perspective on this. Typically what happens with landscape fabric is then a bunch of organic matter and mulch gets piled on top of it, it turns into soil, and now you just have soil on top of your landscape fabric, and now you just have landscape fabric under your weeds. Right? And then it kind of like, the water washes some of it off, and it like doesn't look that nice, and you're like, oh, I gotta rip all
Spreads
this.
microplastics into your soil too.
Spreads microplastics into your, man, landscape fabric's got everything going for them.
Yeah.
So, and I know a lot of us have done this because like a landscaper recommended it or it seems like a really good idea, and I get it, we've all been there. But I was saying moving forward, I wouldn't do landscape fabrics.
Is there any situation where you would?
No.
Okay.
The one place where sometimes we see, and this isn't you, there are certain crops that you do produce with plastic. So like strawberries are grown on plastic. There's a couple of them that we grow on plastic for very, very, very specific reasons. But like that's, I mean, if you're a strawberry farmer, I'm not gonna say it's not you, but I assume you are not a strawberry farmer. Okay.
Underneath hardscapes, you might use it still.
Yeah, even then though I find that like leaves and everything settle into it over time, and it's fine.
The coconut fiber ones though, for seed, protecting seed beds and
Those
stuff.
are great, yeah, the
That's
coconut
okay.
flower ones,
For
because
sure.
they break down. Under hardscape, I wouldn't do it, but if someone did it, I'd be like, I understand. You know, like I'd be like, I understand why you do that. And we talked about this earlier, but disturbing soil leads to weed germination, so just be careful not to mix the soil and the mulch up, right? You want that mulch laid just right on top. You don't want to mix any of it up. And this really does work, right? So these are mulched plants. These were not mulched. These are a bunch of either pendant or dead nettle little winter annual weeds that have come up all around it, right? The mulch was enough to keep all those little winter annuals down. There's been some research shown. So what you have here is you have the mulch depth in inches on this axis. You have the weed cover, percent weed cover that was that came up. So with no mulch, you get 90% weed cover. At 3 inches, you're down to about 25% weed cover, right? And that's why we give that 3-inch recommendation. Is, you know, 6 inches just seems like a lot of mulch. You know, you get down to 10%. That was a lot of mulch to spread. So like 3 inches is fine. And again, just don't. Just don't. It's like mulch season right now too, and I'm driving around getting bummed out by all these mulch plants. If this is your tree, excavate them. Get them out of there. You don't want that. You should be able to see the flare at the bottom of the tree, right? This is not a thing.
Can you go back real quick to that picture between mulch and no mulch? Yeah.
sheet mulch or whatever it might be, and you just kill these guys out, and you've killed that first flush, and you have kind of a pristine spot to be planting in. When it gets re-scaffolded, or nest, all those seeds might come up again, but it's a nice way to kind of get that first flush out of the way. Talked a little bit about this, but pruning and mowing, very, very useful. The whole goal here is to just exhaust the perennial weeds. You are just trying to get them to flush out new leaves and stems so many times that they die of exhaustion, right? That's the goal here. The goal is to get them to die of exhaustion before you do. This can take a while. So, if you have a lot of weed sleep present, this is a time to use a bagger on your mower, right? You don't actually just need to be spreading it then back out into the lawn. Hand weeding, labor intensive, maybe therapeutic. Sometimes it can be really nice out there. Humans can occasionally have a destructive spirit. Sometimes it's nice to get out there and just go for it, make some progress. It's good for small annual weeds. It can be very hard on perennial weeds unless you're vigilant. I think we all know the feeling of I can just grab that dandelion. I don't need the puller, and you're pulling it, and then you feel the pop. And you're like, cool, the entire top root's still in there. I have done nothing. Awesome. So, just actually get the roots. This is often your only real method for weed control aside from mulch in ornamental and mixed plantings, right, where you have grasses and broadleaves together. Just make sure you get the roots. Do make sure to treat all your perennial weeds before planting. So this is another time where sometimes we do see herbicide use is in the preparation of new beds. So that's a time when sometimes people will use glyphosate to kind of spray everything, kill all those perennial weeds, and according to the label, actually, you don't hardly need to wait any time at all. I would probably recommend waiting a couple weeks. And then you're starting with a nice, fresh bed, right? That's really nice. Just Florida betony roots. What is that? A weird string of rooty pearls, just gnarly and awesome. Just kind of want to include those right where I can. Another thing that's really helpful is only watering where you need to water, right? These weeds come out because they get flushes of sunlight and they get watered. You don't need to be watering the whole garden, right? You need to be watering your plants. So things like sober hose, targeted micro irrigation can be really, really helpful. It's also just a lot more efficient. A lot of times you can put these systems on timers, so they're also watering extremely early in the morning, so the water has time to soak in before it burns off in the sun. I typically, if I have an irrigation system, I actually set it to run before morning showers. Never had a house with good enough water pressure that can be running with morning showers, so oftentimes I'll be running at 4 a.m. around then, because all the water can soak into the soil, sun comes up and it dries off any that might still residually be there, so I don't have kind of a wet, muggy condition quite as much. All right, now we're getting to it. So one of the major places where you see pre-emergence is in preventing weeds, grass weeds in lawns. Because I can put out a pre-emergent that prevents weed seeds from germinating in a lawn right now, in like a fescue or Bermuda lawn right now, and the crabgrass won't come up. It won't be able to germinate properly. So I've knocked out all those weeds. And that can actually be pretty useful, right? If I accidentally overspread and I hit my native perennial bed that I was very excited about all my little seedlings coming up, they're not coming either. If I apply it at the same time that I overseed my fescue lawn, none of that's coming up, right? So like you do need to be targeted about how you do this. It typically is, it's a granular, it has to be watered in, and what it really does is it forms a seal in the top couple inches of the soil where even though the plants germinate, they cannot germinate properly. So a little tiny baby plant root, the radicle comes out and it just like gets fried. Often lasts 10 to 12 weeks. This is really, really, really effective for annual weeds, right? We can control winter annuals by applying in the fall. We can control summer annuals by applying in the spring. You have to know what you're targeting because it's not going to prevent any weeds that are already established. And it's not going to prevent weeds that are germinated but small enough that you can't see them, right? That's a big thing. It's like a lot of times we go out in the lawn and we're like, there were no weeds at all and now it's flowering. And you're like, that means there were weeds, you just didn't see them. Right? So if you're outside the right window of fall or spring for this, it doesn't work. Again, the way it works is literally by forming this little barrier. If that seed is in that barrier zone, it can't germinate properly, it comes out and it fries basically. But if it was actually underneath that, it can grow through it. So it really does need to be kind of these annual weed seeds that are sitting just on top. A lot of times for spring in the garden or in lawns, they say to apply it just before the dogwood blooms. Is like a typically a good indicator of like it being day lengths are right and temperatures are right. I always think that's kind of an impossible thing to imagine because all I can see is like the dogwoods bloomed, I'm too late. But it's kind of this time period we're in right now is when we would be applying a pre-emergent to most lawns, if you're going to.
Is there something that consistently blooms before the dogwoods?
Our winter jasmine blooms really early. It's the one that looks like forsythia but blooms earlier than forsythia. It's a close relative. So once you start seeing like a yellow shrubby affair, maybe that's the time. Yeah, or just put it on your calendar, right? Like, think February, think early March. Okay, so post-emergent herbicides are the ones that kill plants after they have germinated, right? So pre-emergent, before emergence, post-emergent, after emergence, right? Like this is the scheme. They are typically applied to the leaves as a spray. They're most effective on young, actively growing plants. This makes a lot of sense, right? Once a plant is big and beefy and flowering and setting seed, like it's entrenched, right? Like it's got its defenses up, it doesn't care. But when they're young seedlings that are just coming up, that's the easiest time to target them. Oftentimes when plants are stressed because of drought or cold or whatever else is going on, they're not actually actively growing as much. And so these don't work quite as well because what we're really targeting is actively growing plants. And again, just not very effective on mature blooming or seeding plants. Like once you're there, like break off the seed heads, throw them away and like hand pull if you want. So within the post-emergence, we have two major categories. We have contact and systemic. Contacts just kill what it touches. It mainly is effective on small annual weeds. These are some of the conventional options. Pelargonic acid is an active ingredient. Dicot is a brand name. Pelargonic acid you'll often see mixed into other things, but it's an acid. It burns the leaves, right? That kind of makes sense. So these contact herbicides really work like they hit a leaf, they burn it and kill it. That's what happens.
Is it from Pelargonium? Do you know?
I don't know. Yeah, great question. Vinegar is kind of the organic option you typically see in this category. It's not just like cooking vinegar, it's a higher concentration vinegar. It's effective-ish. And oftentimes it's such high concentration that you really don't want to be getting it on your skin, right? It's an acid that burns, like that's how it works, so you don't want to be getting it on your skin. Contact herbicides in general, I'm a little bit skeptical of because they're just going to kill whatever So these can work, and this is an organic option that is certainly available, but like I don't find them to be terribly effective, if I'm being honest. Unless the weeds are really young, at which point like maybe a scuffle hoe or something else like that would work better.
Vinegar's really cheap though.
Yeah.
And you can make it up real easy, you don't have to worry about it, any, harmful effects from it.
Yeah.
And then if it works, and you just say, okay, I'm done.
Yeah, that's true.
And then it also then isolates out the weed that doesn't work on it, makes it easier to just say, okay, I'm gonna target this particular one.
Yeah.
Those are my, so I
think
know what
that's
you're
fair.
saying, but
I get it
those
there
are
with my
things to
scuffle
think
and my
about.
flame weeder first myself, but yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I've tried vinegar, and it hasn't worked. I've just had no luck with it.
Depends on what it is. I've had
Yeah,
some
so maybe
success
try it if
with
you're
it.
interested, but like, if as a recommendation, I'd be like, maybe.
I've tried it, it works for like a couple of weeks.
Mixing it with salt,
months.
making the salt, liquid salt,
Vinegar and
the vinegar make any difference?
soup.
I would always, the only reason I'm gonna say no
Some
to that
soup to
is
it.
because I would always be buying horticultural vinegar and I'd just be following the label,
Okay,
and that's like my like extension answer.
okay,
If it's not on the label, I wouldn't know.
okay.
Don't usually like to have salt in your soil either.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so systemics, these work really by being translocated, right? So you spray them, they hit the leaves, and then they move all down into the plant. They move down into the roots, they move through the whole thing. This is really kind of where the business is. Again, most effective when the plants are actively growing. After rainfall is good because a lot of times the plants are kind of like feeling good. You know, you like to hit them when they don't expect it. Moderate temperatures, if it's really cold or really warm, they're not actively growing quite the same way. They don't act as quickly as contact herbicides, right? So as contact herbicide hits the leaves, burns it, kills it. These have to move through the plant, so sometimes it can take 7 to 10 days, right? And so you might spray it and you're like, nothing happened. Come back 2 weeks later and like, it got walloped, right? Most herbicides that you're gonna be purchasing are systemic, and that's because most of the like conventional herbicides that you're gonna be purchasing are some sort of glyphosate Roundup formulation. I will say now that I actually think most of them are gonna be triclopyr, but glyphosate was the old thing we used to use. So within the systemic herbicides, we have selective and non-selective. So selective kills certain types of plants. So right, this is what we've been talking about, where it can kill a grass in broadleaf, it can kill a broadleaf in grass. Sometimes they can separate out sedges from other grasses, which is really, really effective. As opposed to the non-selective ones, like glyphosate and triclopyr, they just kill everything, right? Like glyphosate, it kills anything it touches. And it does that by really like disrupting the plant's growth and signaling patterns.
So,
Yeah.
totally ignorant on using it. So if you wanna get rid of grasses, you go to, what are you looking for? You're reading a label that says just kills Monica?
What is around the grasses?
Like clover. I wanna keep the weeds and get rid of grasses.
I love this. Yeah, I'm totally, this is how you should use these. So to kill your grass but keep the weeds, I would be going for a selective, and it will say, it will probably be one that's like targeted for flower beds and that kind of stuff, and it will say like kills grass weeds. Right, and then you're gonna open the label and it'll probably say like, for use around ornamentals and flowers and that kind of stuff, and it'll say what it won't kill. But you're looking for something that kills grass weeds.
Yes.
As opposed to someone who wants to kill the weeds in their grass.
No.
Right, which would be looking for treatment for broadleaf weeds in their turf, right? So you're kind of looking for, does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
When when the systemic herbicide takes effect and the foliage of the plant is dead, you'll want to throw that in the bin instead of putting it in the compost, right? Because of, like, it could persist in the,
Not with glyphosate,
okay.
not with this one.
Triclopyr can?
Triclopyr might have slightly longer, but I would actually, its half-life is not long enough that I would be concerned about that. It's in the order of a couple weeks, and composting takes longer than the half-life of that. That's a personal preference, right? Like if you were like, I just don't want that around, 100%, but like when I think about like the actual possibility for action, I'm not worried about it, to be honest.
I had gotten some contaminated compost actually.
Totally different story.
Okay.
So we do, okay, and I'm gonna start moving along quickly, but we do have contaminated compost issues around here. That is And they don't wanna be reapplying that stuff all the time, they wanna apply it once or twice a year, so they use these chemicals with really long residual actions. Really long residual actions, on the order of months. And tomatoes are the most sensitive thing in the whole wide world to this. They're like the canary in the coal mine for it. So even if all your other plants would be fine, your tomato like smells it. And starts like growing distorted and being all weird, right? 'Cause tomatoes are divas. So that is a real problem, but for things that you're gonna buy as a homeowner, that would be like a restricted use product that only a farmer can buy. They never should have let it off the farm, that's off label. There's problems already with what's going on there, like it shouldn't have happened. But for these homeowner products that contain things like glyphosate and triclopyr, I wouldn't worry about it. Yeah. I've had this happen to me twice. Yeah. Okay. So as a review, we have got pre-emergence, post-emergence. Within post-emergence, we have contact and systemic. And within systemic, we have selective and non-selective. Okay. Just follow the label. That's your application method. That's your method. Always follow the label. There are a couple different ways you can do things. You can do foliar applications. I think this is kind of interesting because it allows them to only spray in a very, very, very small window. You can also actually instead put the milk jug over the plant you want to protect, right? And not hit it. Cut and paint is what we talked about, like with the tree removal, where you're going to cut it down to the ground, paint the stump. Hack and squirt is when the plant is too big for that, so instead you hack almost like cups into the side of the big stem and you just squirt down into it. This is our controlling invasive plants document from the North Carolina Botanical Garden. They go over these methods in detail. I'll include a link to this in our follow-up notes. They give recommendations on what to do, how to do. This is a really, really good reference. Really good reference. Some notes on glyphosate, just because like I think this is very important to know. Again, go to the store and if you start looking down here in the active ingredients on those roundups at this point, they're not glyphosate, they're triclopyr, so if you hit the soil, you got a problem. There are a number of different formulations that will be glyphosate or triclopyr plus, right? Plus some other thing. And it will typically be a rapid action formulation, which will make it work even faster, so it might have a burn to it. It might have like an acid to it, or it might, the other one you see too is oftentimes something that gives it a longer residual, right? So now all of a sudden it works for months instead of that one moment, which can be really problematic if you're trying to plant and do it later. Yeah.
Going back to some of those acids, they aren't strong enough that they would significantly affect your soil pH or anything?
No.
Okay.
I wouldn't worry about that.
Okay.
But it's a good question. So this typical one that we see is glyphosate versus and hyaluronic acid mixed together. So the reason they call it rapid action is because the glyphosate, remember, can take 7 to 10 days to work because it's a systemic film. The hyaluronic acid is a quick burn. They sell that because it looks better. Right? You go out and you're like, it burned, wonderful. But the way the glyphosate gets into the plant is through healthy leaf tissue. Okay, so do we have a concern now about this being included in the mix? Like this kills the leaves and this, yes, absolutely. There's a really strong possibility that you're going to reduce the activity, right? And so actually, if I'm going to be honest with you, the hardest product to find right now is just glyphosate. I can't find it. The only place I can find it is as a concentrate, which normally I don't like buying concentrates. And it's typically out at like garden centers, not at big box stores. You're gonna have to mix it up yourself. It's annoying. Here's the world we live in, right? But I would really be careful and stay away from some of these like dual action, rapid action, mega action, all these things. Unless you really know what you're getting into, I would stay away from that kind of stuff because they're either gonna have burns in them or they're gonna have long residual lives where all of a sudden you don't know how long that's actually gonna be impacting your soil. Because the whole point of glyphosate is that it doesn't have soil residual activity. They've added something with soil residual activity to get it to last that long. controlling woody weeds, time of year is very, very important. So for deciduous plants, August to September can be really, really effective. And that's because, again, they're trying to put up all their resources in storage for winter, right? So it can be a nice time to try and kind of really whack them. For conifers and evergreens, April to May, because that's actually oftentimes when they're waking up and pushing out new leaves, right? So it's kind of during these really active growth periods. Once these are large, it's much more difficult to remove them, so hand weeding and just being kind of on that rotation is really useful, right? Like taking out that 18-foot Bradford pear was more of a production than if like I had noticed it however many years ago and just plucked it out, right? And then this is the paint and cut, so just if you're going to go down to a stump, treat that fresh stump with probably something like glyphosate or here to prevent it from suckering back out.
Yeah,
Love
that's a
me a
problem
friendly.
for me.
Okay, I didn't bring mine because I sat in this class one time and watched a different agent light their flame weeder at the front of the class. And I was impressed, but I was also like, please don't let my boss walk by. So this is a backpack version. I really like these small versions. You can get them at the big box stores where it almost looks like a cane. And then they have these little tanks that are just like this big. The whole setup is not terribly expensive and it's awesome. It's extremely effective for things like walkways, gravel, not your dry lawn. Know where your water source is. Wear closed-toed shoes. Do the things. But very, very effective. For grass weeds, it will be harder. Like these are little grass weeds poking up because the growth point, again, remember, is at the very bottom, right, tucked between those bricks. It's going to be hard to kill that. This one, you can kill. You're not trying to light them on fire, although it's fun. It's not the goal. You're actually trying to heat all the little water in their cells until they explode, right? So it's enough to kind of scorch it over it, and you'll see the little leaves like, right? That was enough. That was enough. It will leave you with a bunch of weird, squirrely looking dead weeds in your path, so you'll have to resolve them.
But you'll be probably the envy of the entire neighborhood.
You look rad. Yeah. Like it's fine. Like every little kid from like 10 miles away will go, what is that? Okay. So really quick, what would you do? And then we'll go to the break. All right. So to control cool season annuals in March, what are some ways we could control cool season annuals in March? Pull them. Yeah. Yeah. What else? Yeah. If we're worried about seeds.
Trim them after they blow.
Yeah, trim them back. Exactly right. Yeah, so hand weeding, hoeing, small weeds, spray with post-emergent if you want to, but like, does that really need to be done? A huge part of gardening is looking somewhere else for a while. Plants don't care about how you wanted them to look. So I probably would not go with a chemical for that sort of situation. It's just not worth it. Hand weeding if I'm really offended, mowing if I just want it to all be the same height again. To control warm season annuals in March. So what can we do now to prevent warm season annuals? Pre-emergent. Also mulching, right? It's not going to work for the crabgrass in your lawn, but it is going to work for the weeds in your flower beds, right? Warm season annuals in late June.
Post-emergent.
Post-emergent could work.
Hand pull it.
Hand pull it.
Fire.
Fire.
Burn it.
Fire is. I would always wonder. Yeah, you know, could this be solved with fire? Yeah, exactly. So, and this would be a case where a fire is really a good idea because you're surrounded by neighbors. Not so much, right? And here I can use almost any chemical, right? Like I could use a systemic chemical. That's what I prefer. It doesn't have to be selective because there's nothing else around it. Here I'm going to have to be using something that's selective, right? Because I'm trying to kill a broadleaf weed in grass. you wanna include prevention, cultural, mechanical options, chemical, if that's warranted. You might wanna do that, you might want not, or you might not. The client might wanna do that, they might not, right? We need to follow their lead in terms of what they're looking for in answers. You guys are good, I'm gonna skip this. The thing I wanna say is, again, remember, these chemical options are here, right? They're fine, they are a safe step on the ladder, but you need to be working up to it, you need to follow the label, you need to know what you're doing, and just because you have that step doesn't mean you always have to use it, right? But it's okay. And then some pictures from yesterday, that's my little speed bubble blooming out on the side of the building. I know! I found it, I was so excited, like, look at this little, like, happy group. Anyway, okay, sorry, we had a question?
Do you have a good resource for identifying weeds? Because that seems like,
Yeah, so
you
in
know,
our second part.
it's hard to figure out if I should leave that or not.
Yeah, so in the second part of the class, we'll be doing some weed ID, and we have some groups will have a different text, but we have two major resource texts that I like. Weeds of the South and Weeds of the Northeast. Weeds of the Northeast is actually really good because it was written partially by our weed specialist at NC State, so we just know it's a good one. This is also a good one with great pictures. And then the other thing I would actually really recommend, don't use it in the exercise, because it would be like cheating. Picture this, or Seek by iNaturalist. Seek, it's an app by iNaturalist, is extremely good at getting these. It doesn't get everything, but it gets so many weeds because so many people are trying to figure out what their weeds are that it like gets fed a lot of that data. Yeah, and I'll write it on the board, but it's an iNaturalist app. See, you can submit your photos too, so it's kind of cool, like citizen science stuff. That's a terrible photo.
But it's separate from the iNaturalist app?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like a mini app just for this kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you.
And it's,
Does it also
I always
specify
thought the
plants?
apps were not good enough
Does it
because for a long time they weren't, and I could get it faster.
Indoor plants?
And then like a year and a half ago, I tried this one, and it was just like, oh,
iNaturalist is pretty good.
yeah, I'm glad I'm like personable because like otherwise like this is not. It's worrying.
iNaturalist is good because
That was really
Well,
good.
I do have
So, yeah.
natural, but I thought it
Are
was
there
one of those.
Seek is
like thinking about weeds that are sprouting right now and like early season insects that might need them, and if we take them out, they don't get them.
Yeah,
What's your
yeah.
don't then leave?
I mean, I like personally am like, I'm like not like a chaos agent. Like I want things occasionally to look nice, but in general, if I don't have a reason to be taking it out, I just don't. You know, because again, a lot of these like early and late blooming weeds are native and they're supporting native pollinators. Like I don't really care what's no offense. I don't really care what's happening with honeybees because from my perspective, they're just European livestock. But like, what's going on with our like native pollinators? I would be like, they're evolved with our native plants, and they need these resources. So if I don't have a reason to take it out, I don't. I just like take pictures of it with my phone and think it looks nice. Yeah. All right, snacks. Snacks. Okay, so short snack break tomorrow. We are going to be here today. We are going to get back at noon for 11. Yeah.
Can I make a quick
Oh,
announcement?
yeah. This is important.
Hi all, I'm Courtney, if you haven't met yet, and I love collecting food waste. So I brought a blue 5-gallon bucket from Lowe's that's next to the trash can. So if you'd be willing to contribute your non-meat food waste to the bucket after snack, that would be great, and I'll take it home to my compost.
Yes. All right. Snacks and composting.
and the oranges, right? Something about
Yeah, orange peels, apple, bananas. Bananas I use in my yard all the time.
But orange
My,
peels,
even my plants.
orange pills you're supposed to avoid.
Sorry.
Or are they okay?